Joy Harjo, U.S. Poet Laureate, member of the Muskogee Creek Nation. Remember the sky that you were born under. Know each of the stars' stories. Remember the moon. Know who she is. Remember the sun's birth at dawn. That is the strongest point of time. Remember sundown and the giving away tonight. Remember your birth, how your mother struggled to give you form and breath. You are evidence of her life and her mother's and hers. Remember your father. He is your life also. Remember the earth whose skin you are. Red earth, black earth, yellow earth, white earth, brown earth. We are earth. Remember the plants, trees, animal life, who all have their tribes, their families, their histories too. Talk to them. Listen to them. They are alive poems. Remember the wind. Remember her voice. She knows the origins of this universe. Remember, you are all people, and all people are you. Remember, you are this universe, and this universe is you. Remember, all is in motion, is growing, is you. Remember, language comes from this. Remember the dance language is, that life is. Remember. We're talking about cultivating relationship this month. Cultivating relationship. And we're starting this week with our relationship to this land and to those who've come before on it, who are still here. And I'm going to start with something that might be an odd take, and I try and mostly avoid this sort of blatant promotion of television, but I just can't help myself today. Have you been watching Ted Lasso? Ted Lasso, anyone? Okay, a couple of people. Okay. You have to get Apple TV to do it. But it is so worth it if you can figure it out. Oh, Ted Lasso, a parable of love and leadership for our times. So we're going to talk more about Ted another time, but he's really my current ministerial role model. But today I actually want to talk about Coach Beard, who's Ted's right-hand man. You don't actually need any context for this, but I'll just say the premise is they're American football coaches who've shipped off to the UK to coach high-level soccer, a game that they know nothing about, and which, of course, is one of the most beautiful morals of the story. Good coaching, good leadership, good teamwork comes from the quality of relationship that we cultivate, not from expertise or knowledge. But all of that's besides the point. The point is that Coach Beard, the strong and silent type, you can kind of get it from his name, the gruff wingman, bearded and second in command. He's sitting back in his chair reading a book called The Hidden Life of Trees. And when a colleague complains about not getting enough credit for his ideas, Coach Beard offers the slightly oblique response. We used to believe that trees competed with each other for light. Suzanne Simard's fieldwork changed that perception, and we now realize that the forest is a socialist community. Trees work in harmony to share the sunlight. Have you heard about this research? The worldview of competition as the fundamental organizing principle of life, it's on its way out. It's an ancient worldview in some parts of the world. It focuses attention on resource scarcity and understands relationships to be driven primarily by the needs of individual organisms or tribes or species to outcompete others for the ability to survive and reproduce. This worldview comes to us, of course, most directly through what I understand is somewhat of a misinterpretation of Darwin's work, the evolutionary worldview of survival of the fittest. But Simard's work has revealed through meticulous, methodical research what many of the indigenous peoples of this land have known for a long, long time. When seen from a wide enough lens, the basic orientation of an ecosystem is not competition, but cooperation. The variation in kinds of trees in an old-growth forest, not to mention the myriad plants, fungi, and creatures of the understory, serve to maximize the shared goal of turning as much sunlight as possible into usable energy. In these cooperative forest systems, nothing is wasted. The entire community of the forest works in tandem to most efficiently benefit all. When the Puritans first came to what we now call North America, what might be better named in the mythopoetic imagination of the first peoples here as Turtle Island. When the Puritans first came, they couldn't help but read the land and the people living here through the lens of their own culture, their worldview, right? Refugees of religious wars of the Reformation and fleeing the tyranny of British aristocracy, the Puritans found on this continent land that seemed to them pure, pristine, unspoiled by the corruption of the forces that they fled. They wrote of their mission to raise Eden from the wilderness. Right? We'll build a land. William Bradford, governor of the colony at Plymouth, wrote of his people's dreams. The place they had thoughts on was some of those vast and unpeopled countries of America, which are fruitful and fit for habitation, being devoid of all civil inhabitants. That quote came from a book called Saving Paradise. Saving Paradise, How Christianity Traded Love of This World for Crucifixion and Empire. It's by the contemporary theologians Rebecca Parker and Rita Nakashima Brock, and I'm going to teach a class to go in depth with this history. It's an undertaking, but those of you who are up for joining me, it'll be good to do, starting in January, so check out the newsletter for a note about that. But in this profound retelling of the history of Christianity, tracing how the religion evolved culturally and theologically over the past 2 millennia, in one of the later chapters, they describe the encounters between the Wampanoag and other indigenous peoples of the Northeast and the Puritans. And they describe that in the Pilgrims' religious imagination, they quote, wilderness was a place of trial and opportunity. Venturing into it was a contest against evil, a pure process of purification, and a pathway to the apocalyptic recovery of paradise. They write, Puritans, inheritors of the Calvinist iconoclasm, distrusted their senses. Right? We don't have any images in our sanctuary. We don't have images of stories because we inherited this distrust of image and senses from the Protestants. Inheritors of a Calvinist iconoclasm distrusted their senses. Their religion had taught them that the world was filled with deceptive images, decoys from the devil. Unlike the Algonquin peoples, for whom astute observation of the immediate world was a key to understanding whether Manitou, spirits, the spirit of the world, were sinister or friendly. The Puritans believed instead that Scripture was the most reliable guide to truth. So not their senses, but sola scriptura. The Indians were occasionally seen, therefore, through the lens of the Bible. They interpreted the land and people of New England through the theological script provided by their Bible. So occasionally seen as innocent Indians, the original inhabitants of Eden, to be treated as children. Or sometimes they were seen as the Canaanites, the illegitimate inhabitants of the Promised Land, who were to be vanquished, whose land was to be taken. Or they were viewed as the lost Jewish tribes who were to be converted as preparation for the dawn of the new millennium. More often, they were regarded as agents of Satan, whose presence in Eden was to be resisted or destroyed, they wrote. I think what we can hear echoes of those original biblical visions of native peoples in new forms through the intervening centuries. The noble savage, or the glorification of the idea that native people lived in a more natural state. I think we tend to, in our modern lives, sometimes romanticize, imagine that those ideal tribal life, still dehumanizing and mythologizing those people who we see as other. And I think perhaps the most dangerous lie in our mythology now is that native peoples are all gone, no longer exist or matter. And the reality, of course, is the opposite. In the face of ecological catastrophe, often indigenous groups are on the front lines of fights to care better for the earth. The Lakota and other Sioux activists from many other tribes, supporters of all kind, they've stood fast now for 5 years at Standing Rock, fighting to protect land and water from a proposed oil pipeline. All across the continent this is happening. Indigenous groups are fighting legal and moral battles over land that was taken, treaties that were broken. For some, this has looked like small victories of a new land ceded to a tribe with rights to build a casino and lift their people out of abject poverty. But for others, they've actually explicitly rejected the casino plan, like the Onondaga in upstate New York, whose battle has centered on holding the government and corporations accountable for cleaning up a century and more of degradation to sacred lands. This is how they describe their suit. The Onondaga people wish to bring about a healing between themselves and all others who live in this region. Bring about a healing. In this region that has been the homeland of the Onondaga nation since the dawn of time. The nation and its people have a unique spiritual, cultural, and historic relationship with the land, which is embodied in Guyana Shagoa, the law of peace, the great law. This relationship goes far beyond federal and state legal concepts of ownership, possession, or legal rights. The people are one with the land and consider themselves stewards of it. It is the duty of the nation's leaders to work for a healing of this land, to protect it and pass it on to future generations. The Onondaga Nation brings this action on behalf of its people in the hope that it may hasten the process of reconciliation and bring lasting peace, justice, and respect among all who inhabit the area. Some of the most polluted waters in the country, they're fighting the 5 corporations and the government of New York State to repair, to cultivate a new and right relationship with the land. When I lived for a couple years up in Canada, I found myself immersed in a national conversation about truth, healing, and reconciliation with First Nations that is far more developed and substantial than our public conversation here in the United States. And it's in part due to the greater percentage of the population that Indigenous people make up there. And it's also because significant legal victories have come because the treaties made and broken with the First Nations were treaties with the Crown, the English sovereign, which still takes precedence over provincial or national laws. But really at its heart, I heard in the public conversation in Canada people taking stock of their own broken relationship to the land, of the inheritance of harm done to both the people and the more than human world that they live in. So I don't have much patience for fantasies that Indigenous cultures were pristine and perfect, that they had the right answers to every way that white folks have gone wrong. But I know the same thing that you know, I think, that we as a society have a lot to learn from the fragmented indigenous cultures that have survived. And I think in order to stop causing harm and start learning, we're going to need to do that hard work of cultivating relationship. Not cultivating relationship afresh, but starting with the brokenness. Grieving all that's been lost, working small step by small step in the arduous labor of repair. Repairing injustice that unfolded over centuries will take centuries. Lamenting and honoring what has happened on the land that we inhabit, the land which shapes our own inner landscape in so many ways. Repairing our collective relationship to the land, repairing our relationship to the web of life, it's all bound up in our relationship with our own deepest selves. Repairing our relationship to our own soul, mending our hearts that are daily broken in our imperfect world. And I think part of our work around this here in Marin is to interrogate our theology of nature. As Unitarian Universalists, we're direct descendants of Henry David Thoreau, who the scholar Braun Taylor names as the de facto founder of what he calls an emerging form of religiosity known as dark green religion. Adherents and practices of dark green religion vary widely. But it's not hard to imagine that if we took all the various shades of nature spirituality and included them under Taylor's umbrella of dark green religion, this kind of religion is really a powerful force, if not the dominant religion here in Marin. But there's a superficial hollowness to much of the devotion to nature that we hear expressed. And the part of it that's been weighing on my mind lately has to do with how we talk about development and housing. As I think about what it means to cultivate an ethical relationship to this land that we live on. So you know that one way it gets expressed is we must preserve nature by resisting all development. And there are, of course, developments that harm our planet, poison our water, denigrate the homes of the more than human world. Developments that must be resisted, like that pipeline at Standing Rock. But the same nature theology is also used to justify resistance to building affordable housing. Not here, we want to protect our open space. Not here, where it would change the character of our community. Housing density in this schema is a threat to the preservation of the natural world. But I really think this is a nature theology that's been twisted. It's a nature theology that leads to a privatized understanding of nature. That separate and pure Eden that must be preserved to be privately enjoyed by those who have means to access it. The theology of privatized nature, like the twisted theology of the Puritans our culture descends from, imagines that now we have claimed this promised land, we must defend it against the Canaanites and other illegitimate inhabitants, the impoverished masses who, if allowed to dwell in paradise, would somehow sully it. Reverence, real reverence for the natural world actually invites a very different moral stand. It asks us to consider how would we approach our human family if we lived like a forest. Segregation should be the worst kind of anathema to the people who hold nature to be sacred. There's no segregation in the forest. It would undermine the best interests of all the species involved in the grand endeavor to survive. And yet the redlining, which once legally and blatantly segregated our county, lives on in arguments about character of neighborhoods in opposition to projects that would build affordable housing too close to affluence. But I think a new and stronger root system is growing. Linda Howman described to me a city council meeting in Mill Valley where a proposal for the city to donate a piece of land to build housing was being discussed. There were, of course, a few folks there to proclaim, "Not in my backyard," as you might expect. But what surprised Linda and surprised me is not only were the vast majority of people there to express support for building this housing, but that the refrain spoken again and again at that meeting was simply this: it's the right thing to do. To repair our relationship to our people and the land, it's the right thing to do. To care for neighbor and stranger, it's the right thing to do. To walk more lightly on our earth, it's the right thing to do. And I don't know the ins and the outs of the proposal being worked on for what to do with the land that sits right across the freeway from us here. But I know that the goals of inclusionary housing, that's how much housing is devoted to affordable housing in a new project. The goals for inclusionary housing in projects like the one being considered for Northgate Mall fall far short of what they should and could be. Currently, the bar is to make 10% new units affordable, while in other cities nearby, citizens have spoken up and demanded 20 or even 25% of big projects produce affordable housing. So I've been wondering, how might we, and I don't have an answer to this question, how might we as a religious community that holds human life to be inherently worthy, that understands the web of life we are a part of to be inherently sacred, how might we help remind our wider community that building affordable housing is the right thing to do? That the moral response of loving the natural world on its own terms is an ethic of care for all the life around us, not an ethic of control over what happens in our backyards. Remember, the plants, trees, animal life, who all have their tribes, their families, their histories too. Talk to them, listen to them. They are alive poems. Remember the wind, remember her voice. She knows the origin of this universe. Remember, you are all people, and all people are you. Remember, you are this universe, and this universe is you. May it be so, and amen.